Okay, all right, so let me go ahead and share this here. Let's share the screen. Okay, everyone. All right. So we left off, I believe we left off here. We were going to transition to the election cycle here. Let's just kind of let's just kind of backtrack a little bit just to do a little bit of a review. We were talking about voting here, and I just want to make sure that we did talk about some of the issues for low voter turnout. I know I did show you all some of those numbers when it came to, like, especially like in Texas, when it came to low voter turnout rates in Texas, and Texas is looked at as one of the lowest voter turnout rates in the entire state. I'm sorry, in the entire country. It's definitely usually at the bottom of the list in terms of states and their voter turnout rates. So so of course, I showed you all the numbers, but I don't think that we went over this in terms of what were some of the reasons, right? So let's just cover this really quickly also, and if we have, we'll just kind of do it just as a quick recap, and then we'll move on to the election cycle here. So when it comes to voter turnout, so political scientists study why potential voters opt out of elections. Why do we have those low voter turnout rates? And I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, right? That individuals cite the following reasons for not voting as being too busy, whether it's, and not just for career, right? Whether, it's also family obligations. So this leads us to childcare, family care, or work conflicts. What we also need to remember is that, that voting, especially at the national level, that they have it at certain days, right? It's usually that first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So it's early November, right? So coming up at around this time, right? Like next week would be, election day at the national level. So a year from now, pretty much a year from now, is when we're going to be having the presidential election. So that's going to be a very, very exciting time in the study of American politics here. So, but with that being said, there are issues with that, in that Tuesday is a work day, and we don't have. I think I mentioned to you all last time, right, that there has been movement to try to make election day a national holiday so that people will be able to go and vote. But we still don't have that. But that's an idea that's been floated about, and it definitely does seem to make some logical sense here, right? But lack of transportation, you not know where to vote. This is, of course, the complexity of voting in terms of not knowing the locations, not having access to polling locations. Frustrated buyer cannot easily use voting technology. Some people, especially like your older voters, they might not feel too comfortable using those touchscreen kiosks. And they really don't have a choice, they just have to go with what the county is using in terms of technology. Restrictive voter laws, such as ID requirements. So we talked before about how that you need to be able to have a valid government issued ID in order to vote. And some people, because of that lack of transportation, they might not be able to go to the DMV to go and get driver's license and things like that. If they're not able to, if they don't, especially like if maybe some of these people who are elderly, they might not have the ability to go and get their ID updated if, let's say, it's expired. No candidates or issues that interest them, or inability to decide on candidates or issues. So they might not really be too aware of what's going on. They might not really care. It might be, and a lot of this is all interrelated. And the last one, of course, is voter fatigue or apathy, right? So this is the people who might feel like, well, the system's corrupt. What does it matter? Democrats, Republicans, they're all the same, so it really doesn't matter. You probably hear some of those arguments. Well, all of that being said, all of this, of course, builds on this, right? And I think that, a lot of people can have a lot of these reasons listed. It's not just one, right? I think it's a lot of this, right? It's a lot of, people not really knowing, and then people maybe getting frustrated because they don't know, and people don't want to feel like they're stupid. So maybe they just feel like, well, it's too complicated, so I'm not even going to bother. There's a lot of this, right? As well as also the busyness, right? As of course as you all know, we're all dealing with a lot of stuff. We're all so incredibly busy. You all have so many things on your plate as well, not just school, but also extracurriculars, and some of you all work as well. So, life is there's just not enough hours of the day, right? So it definitely does take a commitment to be able to try to keep up with what's going on, and try to keep up in a way where you feel confident in the choices that you make if you're going, when you go vote, right? So So that's it, as well as the complicated nature of our voting system, as we're going to talk a little bit right now in terms of how elections work. It's a little bit complicated. I'll definitely, do my best to explain to you all, but it definitely is something that it's something that frustrates people because they might not know where to start, and they just kind of give up. So again, you can't really blame them, because it's our system. We're going to talk about the Electoral College and how complicated that is, right? So people just might feel like, what, like, why bother? These, there's a lot of corruption going on anyway, so why even bother? So it shouldn't be too surprising, now that we're covering this and now you all are seeing it for yourselves. It shouldn't be surprising as to why, there's not really high voter turnout rates, especially also because, when we look at the way our democracy is run and the way candidates run, that also, goes into it, right? Where candidates engage in personal attacks, and it becomes, just a bunch of mudslinging, and it's not even about the issues, right? It's just about, attacking the other person. So that also becomes, people get turned off by that negativity, so to speak. All right, anyway, but with that being said, let's go ahead and move on now to the election cycle here. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this here. Okay, so now let's get to elections here, right? So the election cycle for federal offices takes several months to complete. This is another reason why people might not necessarily be too keen on voting, because they might feel that the election cycle takes too long. There's constant media coverage. I mean, we're already going to start with the primaries and the caucuses coming up here at the beginning of next year here. So for pretty much an entire year, we're going to be talking nonstop about the presidential election. It's going to happen. I'm sure you all have seen it already. It just happened a couple years ago, right? It's hard to believe that that was just a couple years ago. But here we are again. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about we're going to talk about what the election cycle is and what its components are, right? So let's take a look at some of these definitions, right? So nomination, in which the parties determine their candidates, right? So this is where we get the Republican nominee and the Democrat nominee. How did we get to, in 2020, how did we get to current President Joe Biden versus former President Donald Trump, right? If you remember, on the Democrat side, there were a bunch of other people who were running for president, like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Beto O'Rourke, Michael Bloomberg, and all those, other names, right? So what happened to them? We'll talk about that here right now. That leads us to the primary campaigns. Candidates debate one another, hold town hall meetings and rallies, and run campaign ads, right? So again, and of course, a campaign is very straightforward, right? It's the way in which candidates are able to make their case to the voting public, to try to convince the voters to vote for them, right? To select them as the candidate over someone else, right? So there's a variety of different ways that campaigns are run, right? Debating is one of the most common things that we see in the presidential, the presidential process, right? We've already seen a couple of debates on the Republican side that happened over the summer, and also more recently, even though Trump wasn't a part of that. But he's over there campaigning right now in Iowa and going to these other states. He's already gearing up. We'll talk about why he is in Iowa. Why is Iowa so important? The town hall meetings and rallies, right? So that's what Trump is doing right now. He's going and he's holding these rallies. A rally is basically where you go to, you hold an event. You have potential voters come to hear you out. You give a speech. You talk about potential issues, and you also try to convince your voters to, they call to action, so they'll call them to action to go and turn out to vote for the candidates, as well as running campaign ads. We're already seeing some of those campaign ads being run. I know I'm seeing them on YouTube, as well as on some of the the channels that I'm watching. So of course, campaign ads are meant as a way to make their the candidate look good, talk about what they've accomplished. If, let's say, they used to serve in government, or they're currently serving, like let's say they're an incumbent, then they have that advantage of discussing in the campaign ads what they've done, as opposed to a challenger who they can't say that they've done something because they're trying to get into that job, right? It's kind of like, if, let's say, you're applying for a job, you don't have any experience, so you're talking about, well, I went to school and I studied this, and this is what I'll do. But then you have another candidate who has 10 years experience, and they're going to be like, well, I've done this, and this. So obviously, of course, the companies are going to be more likely to hire the person with experience, because they've actually demonstrated that they know how to do this and they can get it done. So the campaign ads are meant as a way to highlight their accomplishments and why they're the best candidate. Also, in some cases, it's also meant to take shots at the other side, right? So like we kind of talked about, how some of this can be rather negative. The primaries and caucuses, right? So again, this is where voters help select their political party's candidates. So this is where we have the candidates of the same political party running against each other to try to secure that nomination. Now, keep in mind that we're focusing on the presidential election because this is the one that gets the most attention as it's the most evident. But that's not the only position that goes through the nomination process, the primaries, and the conventions. We'll talk about that here in a bit, right? So we're going to go more into detail on this here in a bit. So again, so the primaries and caucuses, the voters help to select their political party's candidates here, right? So so let's see. You know what? Let's go over here and then we'll talk about this. Okay, well that's fine. Well, let's just cover it really quick and then we'll go more detail on convention on the primaries and caucuses and conventions, right? And then the convention, of course, candidates are formally nominated. Once they reach the threshold in terms of securing enough votes, securing enough delegates. Of course, I'll go into detail because I'm a former national delegate, so I can explain a little bit in terms of how this works here. And I have attended both state and national conventions in 2020 here. So I'll explain a little bit in terms of how that works. A general election campaign. This, of course, is where you're moving on from the primary, where you're no longer competing against members of the same party, and you're now moving on to the general election, where you're going to compete against the nominee from the opposing party. And again, I'm going to go more detail on this on the next slide here. General election, of course, election day is in early November, but many states allow early voting, and Texas is one of these states where you can vote early. It's about 2 weeks before the general election day. So we actually do have early voting right now for the Texas constitutional amendment election. This is as of October 2023 when this video is being made. So we do have early voting for that, so I'll explain that as well. And then electoral college, voting for presidential elections only. So we'll talk about the electoral college, and I'm going to show you all the electoral map here. Okay. So that being said, so those who seek elected office do not generally reflect the demographics of the general public. They are often disproportionately male, white, and more educated than the overall U.S. population. And and this is something that we see not just at the national level, but also here in Texas as well. So let's take a look at some of these numbers, right? So when we look at the first chart here, when we look at the gender, right, that it's usually it's pretty much almost split even with a slight majority to women. But look how there's a huge disparity when it comes to between the genders who actually runs for public office, right? It's about 75% male and 25% female, right? So definitely a huge disparity in that we've got a lot more men who are running for political office than women. Let's take a look at the demographics here when it comes to the general public, right? Now, this is a little bit outdated though, because this is from 2014. So the Hispanic population has definitely gone up a bit. And conversely, the white population has gone down, even though, the US is still a majority white here, although also in some of these states, we do have what are called majority minority states, like Texas. Texas has been a majority minority state and basically what that means is where where the population of the state is more minority than the white population. Since the white population is considered majority, you have some of these states where the white population is less than 50%. What we also had, and this came out this past summer in July, they finally, through the census information that they were able to tabulate through estimates, that now Texas is not majority Hispanic, but the Hispanics outnumber whites in Texas. And eventually we'll probably get to a point where Hispanics will be over 50% of the population of Texas. So it'll be a majority Hispanic state later on. So it's definitely moving towards that trend. But look at how that if you've got, but look at this, right? If you've got the white population here about 65%, but it's over 80% of the people who seek public office. And then also for education here, notice how that, look at how when we look at, so the education data is talking about, attainment, right? Educational attainment, right? So I don't know if y'all knew this, but there's not a lot of, the percentage of people who actually graduate from college is not very high, right? It's about 15%, and then post-grad is less than 10%. So this would be like for graduate school. But most of Americans have not finished college. Yet in that time frame, though, you can see that there are, a lot of elected officials who have graduated from college, right? So you see how it's not reflective through these numbers. You should see that it's not reflective of the general population. And, some people have some opinions about that, right? I know, like for the education one, a lot of people would probably say that, they would want for their elected officials to have some sort of credentials. I know this is just kind of like my own personal observations. I know that, like, when I'm looking at candidates, I certainly want to see, and not necessarily education, but do they have experience? Do they know what they're doing? Can their experience translate to what they'll be doing here within elected office? And so I definitely do look at credentials. So I definitely see how, a lot of people would probably want to, want for their elected officials to have credentials, because if you're going to be at the head of government, right, you definitely have to be able to, you have to prove to me as a voter that I'm going to, that I'm going to trust you to be able to make sound, rational decisions. And so that, of course, goes with, and again, it's not just education, right? It's also work experience. Are you qualified, so to speak, right? So I could see how people would definitely want for that, when it comes to education. Not, although some people might feel like, well, I want to elect someone who's more like me. If, let's say, I'm a high school graduate, then maybe I want someone who has, has gone through similar experiences. Because you might also have some pushback on that, because some people might feel like, well, do I really want this college elitist who never really worked out in the field, they were just in academia or something like that. So it's kind of like it really depends. Especially, it also depends on where you're running to, right? If you're running in certain parts of the country, maybe there's more of an affinity for educational attainment as opposed to other places. So it does depend. But these two here are probably a little bit more jarring, right? Because you look at how that, especially like this one, right? This is probably the most disparity one, right? Because when you've got almost equal to the population in terms of gender, but you don't have that equality when it comes to actually serving in government, that might be something where people might feel like, well, what's going on here? And, and is that something that we might want to see change or things like that? So, but okay, so let's go ahead and continue here. So now we have about 15 minutes left. So let's see if we can finish this here really quickly. And if not, then we can definitely kind of take a little bit more time next time. But let's see if we can finish this here. Okay, let's talk about the primaries, caucuses, and conventions. Okay, now I mentioned before how that primaries basically are elections where you're competing against candidates of the same party, right? So primaries look and feel like general elections to voters, but only one political party is represented on the ballot, right? Because the primaries are where you have, like I said, candidates of the same political party that are competing against each other to secure that nomination for that specific seat. Now, this is not just for president, but all these other elected offices also engage in primaries. Now, we're also going to talk about caucuses here, because caucuses basically achieve the same type of result as a primary, but the way it's done is different. But the result is still the same in terms of narrowing down the choices to one nominee per party, per elected office here, right? But again, primaries are where you have these members of the same political party. That's why I was explaining how in 2020, we were able to get President Joe Biden from the Democrat field. But how did that happen, right? Because when you had other people like Bernie Sanders, Liz Warren, Beto O'Rourke, and all these other candidates who were running on the Democrat side, what happened to them? Well, they didn't make it because they didn't win enough states. They didn't get enough votes in the states in order to move on and ultimately get the nomination, right? There is a lot of similarity between sports here, right? Like I said, primaries are basically like the playoffs, where you're competing against teams of the same conference in order to make it, to the big game, right? Whether it's the World Series, oh, please don't remind me, whether it's the Super Bowl, NBA Finals, right? So, and then of course you're going to be competing against the other team from the other conference, right? And then you're going to play against each other in the championship game, right, or the championship series. So primaries are just like that, right? We've got the candidates of the same party competing against each other, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to win. They're trying to get votes within the states. Let me explain how this works, right? So the reason why like these candidates are going to like states like Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, is because those are the states that start the primary process. So the candidates are campaigning in those states because they're trying to win those states, right? They're trying to get more votes than the other candidates so that they can then gain momentum and they can win more states throughout the entire process, right? Because they have to go through all the 50 states. And so winning those states early on is good, because what it does then is that it gives your campaign momentum. It allows for people to jump on the bandwagon, right? Just like when a team is winning, right? The fans are going to they're going to join up with them more so because now their team is winning and they want to be on the winning side, right? Makes a lot of sense. So the way it also works is that depending on the number of votes that you get, that's also going to determine the number of delegates that you get. So the delegates, they come to the convention. So we'll talk about that later. But there's also two types of primaries, right? So in a closed primary state, voters must indicate a political party on their voter registration in order to participate in that party's primary. So this is basically where you may have heard the phrase, oh, I'm a registered Democrat, I'm a registered Republican. That's where this comes from, right? The state of New York does it this way, where if you're going to vote in the primary, you have to pre-register as a member of that party beforehand. So that's a closed primary system. In an open primary state, voters may choose the party primary in which they vote. So Texas has an open system where, and let me explain how this works. So if you ever go vote in the primary, and in Texas, the primary happens in early March. When you go to the polling location and you check in, the first question they're going to ask after you've checked in is, which ballot do you want? Do you want a Republican or a Democrat ballot? Because depending on that, that's going to determine which primary you're going to vote in, right? So if, let's say I say, okay, I want the Democrat ballot. So then they're going to populate my ballot, and it's going to show only Democrats for those seats, right? So and the way that it works is that the federal offices go first, right? So in the last primary that I voted in, you had the candidates for president, you had the candidates for the House, for Congress, and then it moved on down, to like, state and local officials, like your state reps, as well as, your local races, like the party chairperson. So because I decided to vote in the Democrat primary, there's not going to be any Republican names because I'm voting in the Democrat primary. Now, once you get to the general election, then it's of course Republican versus Democrat. But in the primaries, it's just those the same the members of the same party competing against each other. But again, in an open primary system, this is where you make your choice there at the polling location, and I can change that. So like if, let's say, this primary that's coming up here next year, if I want to vote in the Republican primary, I can do that. It doesn't matter that I voted the Democrat one a couple of years ago. I can vote. It's a new primary year, right? So I can switch between back and forth whenever I go vote in there. Now, the thing though is that once I make my selection, I am committed to only participating in that political party's activities up until the convention, which happens in the summer. Okay, so bear with me on this, right? So then a caucus, of course, and again, so a primary is basically an election, right? It is an election. The same process occurs where you go and you check in and you make your selection amongst the candidates. A caucus is a little bit different. It generates the same result because you're having people voting, but instead of voting secretly by yourself, this is kind of like the way, like I don't know if you all remember like class elections when you all were in elementary, things like that. This is kind of like how a caucus is. Caucus states use small informal meetings to determine voter preferences for party nominees. The state of Iowa used to do this. I think they're transitioning to a primary system now because, and you can look this up, a couple of years ago when we had the Iowa caucus, the system crashed. They couldn't get any numbers. It wasn't until like the next day where we finally started to get some numbers. And so it was just a complete disaster. Like whoever that was the head of the Iowa, the state party, I hope they resigned, because that just really looked, bad in terms of, because that's even if it's not technically your fault, you're in charge. So when something that bad happens, it's kind of like, well, you're gonna have to kind of give it up because it's, because sometimes life's like that, right? Like even if it's not technically your fault, but because you're in charge and it was so bad, you kind of have to give that up here. But anyway, the point is that with a caucus, and there's a good video that I'll link to you all where it discusses the Iowa caucus. You can look it up. You can type it in CNN Iowa caucus there on YouTube, and you'll be able to find it. And I want you all to see like how it works, where they basically have like they write the votes down like in papers, again, just like class elections. They've also got them like in high school gymnasiums, and they've got them there like, huddled together in groups, and they're talking to each other. Like let's say you've got one part of the gym was for Joe Biden, another part was for Bernie Sanders, another one was for Liz Warren. So you've got them in their own separate areas, but then you've got people trying to convince them to move to the other side. It's really interesting. It's definitely cool. If you're like a political, enthusiast like me, you definitely find that a lot very interesting, right? Because in voting, like in regular elections, you don't talk to anyone, right? You're just kind of doing your own thing, right? But in the caucus, it's a lot more collaborative, right? You're talking to people, you're trying to convince them, right? You're engaging in some kind of like the essence of democracy, right? And trying to have those debates and discussions. Okay, so the point is that whether it's a caucus or a primary, the candidates are tasked with collecting votes, and from those votes translates to delegates, right? So the parties select their general election candidates at the convention. So both the Republican and the Democrats have their own, and they also have local conventions, right? They have like your county conventions. This happens a couple of weeks after the results of the primary are tabulated and certified. Then we have the state conventions, which happen early in the summer. I know that the state convention that I went to in 2020, that was a virtual one because that's when the virus first started. But I still did attend it, and it was interesting, right? I was able to run for a couple things at the state convention. I ran for to be one of these presidential electors for the Electoral College. I also ran for some seats on some of these committees. I didn't get anything because it was my first convention that I ever attended. I won't forget how that in the lead up to the convention, I was getting a lot of mail from these other members or these other people that were going to attend the convention. They were sending me like pamphlets and mailers like to vote for them to serve on these committees, and I was like, what? Like you can do that? Like I didn't know that. Nobody told me anything like that. So I didn't know that that's how it worked, right? That when you get selected to go to the convention, you have to then try to politic your way onto these committees, right? Because nobody's gonna know who you are if you're not going and sending those the campaign material. It basically is a campaign that you're running yourself. So, but because I didn't know that, that's why I wasn't able to do any of that, and so that's why I really didn't win anything. Although I was selected to be a PLEO delegate, party level elected official, because I had just become a precinct chair a couple of months ago. So I was selected to be a PLEO delegate, and I was able to go to the national convention. Also virtual, but I was still part of the meetings, and it was very interesting, right? So the way these conventions work is where they formally nominate the candidates, and they nominate the candidates through the delegates. Like I said, the delegates are the people who are pledged to support candidates at the convention, right? So, and it works on a proportional basis, right? So let's say like, one candidate gets 60% of the votes in the primary, and let's say there's like 100 delegates in a state. So let's say one candidate gets 60%, another one gets 30, another one gets 20. So from that 100 delegates, then 60 of them are going to go to the candidate that got 60% of the vote, 30 delegates going to go to the 30, and 20 going to go to the 20, and vice versa, right? So then of course the way the convention works is you have the roll call of the voters. That's where they formally tabulate the votes, and then once the presidential nominee clinches the nomination by getting that number of delegates, right? They have a certain threshold that they have to meet in terms of the pledged delegates, and so once they get that number, then they formally secure the nomination. And that's not the only thing that happens at conventions. There's also meetings, because this is the one time where you have so many Democrat and Republican high-ranking officials getting together, right? So they're going to have meetings in terms of setting up the rules for the party, setting up how they're going to go and try to win the election. There's also a lot of speeches given. There's a lot of, it's a very festive atmosphere. So there's a lot of balloons and confetti and all, especially for like once the presidential nomination clinches the nomination. So there's definitely a lot that goes in that in terms of the convention. So again, I went to a virtual one, so we'll see, what might happen in the future, as they're moving back to in person. So, but we'll see how that goes, next year. I might not be as fortunate enough to go to the conventions here. Okay, let's see. Electoral College really quickly. Okay, let's see. Yeah, okay, so let's see. I want to try to, okay. we have about 5 minutes left here. Let's see. We might have to kind of we might have to touch on this next time here. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit about campaign finance, and then let's talk about campaign finance, and then that's what we'll end with for today, and then we'll get to the electoral college next time. That's fine. We can kind of go over that here. Okay, so then let's talk about campaign finance here a bit. So what I also want for you all to understand is that in American elections, that the majority of money that is collected and donated for elections in America is done through private donations, okay? So what this means here is that you don't really have too much public money that goes into elections. The FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, does have a little bit of money. That's why there's a section where you can donate to them, but they don't really have a lot of money. Most of the money comes from private donations, okay? Now, what this does here is this creates a situation where candidates have to try to fundraise and elicit funds from the general public. Now, there is debate about how to do this, right? Because in more recent years, and this was started by Bernie Sanders a couple of years ago, I mean, it had been done before, but he was the one that kind of really pioneered this, was to focus on individual donations, right? Instead of trying to, let me explain this a little bit better. So like, let's say you're a candidate, and let's say you're raising like $1 million. Let's say you've got 10 people who can donate 100,000. That will get you your $1 million just by reaching out to 10 people. But that's only 10 people, right? That's 10 people out of the entire country. It's not really too reflective of the population. So instead, what a lot of these candidates are doing is they're trying to get, let's say, like 1,000. Let's say like 1,000, but even then that's still, I think, like 10,000. But let's say that like it's even lower than that, right? Let's say like 1 million voters, right? And they're all donating like $1, right? So you see how, like, yes, it's a lot less that they're donating individually, but because you're getting so many more of these donations, it's more reflective of the population. So that's kind of the movement here, right? Now, the FEC controls and keeps public records of federal campaign donations. So candidates do have to submit those campaign finance reports to the federal government, as well as the states, if they're running like in state elections. Regulations limit the amount individuals and organizations may donate to campaigns, and candidates must disclose the source of their funds, right? So there are limits to individual donations. It's like about like $3,000, depending on depending on the level of the election you're engaging in. But there have been some Supreme Court decisions that have tried to reverse this, right? Because originally we had legislation such as the McCain-Feingold Act, which had tried to limit the role of these, corporations and organizations that were donating. So if you took like earlier today, I was teaching Texas, and we talked a little bit about Citizens United, but basically what it said here is that the Supreme Court decision said, okay, I know it's already time, right? So, okay, well, you know what? Let's okay, that's fine. We'll go ahead and stop here for today. We'll just cover this again. So we'll finish this chapter next time, and then I think we should be able to start on the next chapter here. So let's go ahead and stop here. Okay. So sorry about that, guys. Let's go ahead and stop here really quickly.